So it's casual, Amy, nothing to worry about. Okay.
Hey, everybody.
Hey.
Welcome to the IOCDF Research Roundtable. It's good to be back. I missed last month. And to see some familiar faces that have been on the show before. My name is Kyle King. I'm now a senior, almost a second semester senior here at Yale. And I've been studying OCD for quite some time. And I'm interested in this disorder because I think it's really fascinating, and also because I have the disorder. And I'm joined by my co-host, Jonathan Abramowitz, here to talk about some of the current research in the field at the intersection of OCD and ADHD today, which is going to be fascinating.
Fascinating indeed. I'm Jonathan Abramowitz. I'm a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I've always been fascinated since I was an undergraduate and in graduate school about OCD, and my career is research and clinical work, helping folks with OCD and helping the field learn more about it.
I didn't know they had colleges back when, I guess you're.
Thank you very much.
Mental lapse, I guess.
We had candlelight. We studied by candlelight. And
oh, yeah, one of those. Okay.
Yeah, we got there on horse and buggies.
You founded it. You founded the university.
I founded the university. Yes, that's right.
Oh, Johns Hopkins. It makes sense. As you can see, we're joined by two guests, but before I introduce them, I have some general announcements that I would like to say. First, this live stream is educational and is not intended to replace therapy. For treatment-related questions, please work with your provider or contact a local clinician. You can use the IOCDF online resource directory at iocdf.org/find-help to locate a trained clinician near you. The International OCD Foundation is not a crisis hotline. If you're in crisis or if you're ever feeling suicidal or unsafe, please go to your local emergency room or call 911 or the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by dialing 988. You can also access this online at www.988lifeline.org. The second announcement, the first one's pretty long, is that we have this live chat function, and we love when you ask questions, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can and pitch them to our experts here. Just know that everything that you put on that chat function will live on the internet forever, and it is live. So please be kind and respectful, and just be aware of everything that you put in there.
And also, just one thing, because people have asked me this before, we are not able to respond in writing to the things you put in the chat. So nothing personal if you address me, but I'm not able to respond. It's just we're not able to like actually type in the chat.
I actually didn't know that.
I don't think. I don't
think I could write and talk at the same time, even if I tried.
Man, you're supposed to be able to do these things.
So, on to the guests. We have two. The first bio that I have on my computer screen is Dr. Amitai Abramowitz. Dr. Abramowitz is the associate professor at the Department of Psychology at Texas State University and is a licensed psychologist and clinical neuropsychologist. He obtained his PhD in neuropsychology from Tel Aviv University, followed by a 4-year research fellowship at the Center of OCD and Related Disorders at Harvard Medical School and MGH, Boo, Harvard. He has published over 50 peer-reviewed manuscripts and book chapters and currently serves on several journal editorial boards and international scientific grant committees. Dr. Abramowitz also serves as the associate editor for several journals, including the Journal of Obsessive Compulsive and Related Disorders. His research interests include cognitive neuropsychology and psychometrics of obsessive compulsive and related disorders, and the interaction between psychopathology and cognitive function, which is a really good segue into what we're going to be talking today, because we're going to talk about a lot of cognitive function related topics. But Dr. Abramowitz, how are you doing?
Doing okay, considering.
Okay, that's a vague and I guess good answer.
It's all about ambiguity.
Yeah, what's the weather like down there in Texas?
Fantastic today.
Oh, you're lucky.
We have summer, and then winter. There is no fall. So apparently we're in the winter stage now.
I think fall is overrated. So I don't think you're missing out on anything. Our other guest is Amy Mary Askin. She's a licensed clinical psychologist and founder and director of the Nashville OCD and Anxiety Treatment Center in Brentwood, Tennessee. She works with individuals with OCD, anxiety, and OC spectrum disorders across the lifespan. She's passionate about working with children, families, and couples, as well as serving individuals in the LGBTQ plus community. Dr. Mary Askin is the author of the book Thriving Relationships with OCD, published in 2022. Additionally, she's active in training and serves as faculty for the IOCDF BTTI and adjunct faculty at Vanderbilt University. How's the weather down there in Tennessee?
It's gorgeous. It's gorgeous. We are still in, we're still in the I think this is like the third or fourth summer before actual fall. So
Yep.
Okay. Wait, before fall? Well, our fall just ended. It's like 30 degrees outside here in Connecticut.
Oh,
no,
wow.
we're like 80.
Yeah,
You're 80? What?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's absurd. That sounds awesome. I had like a full North Face jacket on when I was outside today. But anyway, I'll complain some other time. Let's get talking about OCD and ADHD. So I guess the first question, since I've talked a lot about OCD in my life, but I don't talk a lot about ADHD, and I don't know very much about it, is what is it? What is ADHD?
Amy, you want to start?
Sure, I can start. So ADHD is one of those disorders where you would expect to see symptoms in childhood. So onset of symptoms before age 12, and we're really looking at two clusters of symptoms, one of which the inattentive symptoms are things like poor concentration, misplacing things, making mistakes, difficulty with distractibility, and so forth. And then the other cluster is your sort of hyperactive impulsive symptoms, which would be like interrupting people, trouble taking turns, impulsive behaviors, things like that. And really, there are three different types of ADHD. So we're looking at either primarily inattentive subtype, for whom, and in the DSM, it's like 6 of, I won't go through all the symptoms, but 6 of inattentive symptoms, primarily hyperactive impulsive, which would be having, I think, 6 of the hyperactive or impulsive symptoms and not meeting criteria for inattentive or combined type. So I'm sure you can hear as I'm talking about this, that we're talking about a really heterogeneous disorder. There's a lot of different presentations, and much like OCD, 2 people with ADHD can look quite different.
Dr. Abramowitz, do you have anything to add, or she nailed it?
I mean, I think that the major issue that we need to remember that inattention is a symptom, and it can be caused by thousands of things. It could be anything physiological, psychological. I mean, if right now I'm sitting here and I have, I don't know, social anxiety, how I come across and everything is okay, I basically have, another sort of chunk of my RAM that is preoccupied with something, and this will affect my attention. And ADHD is basically a syndrome that sometimes is mistaken for a symptom. If you have inattention and it's hard to focus and you procrastinate, it does not mean you have ADHD. It means you have something that causes you to struggle with. And I had many people, and also my research, of course, that present with inattention, distractibility, because they have a OCD without anything. They're just preoccupied with obsessions.
Okay. I mean, that does strike me as someone who doesn't know a lot as like somewhat confusing, because if you can have ADHD that's just the inattentive stuff, as Amy was kind of referencing, and that might be an oversimplification, then, inattentiveness does also seem like both a symptom and a syndrome at the same time.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say, I mean, Dr. Abramowicz's research addresses this a lot, and this idea that inattention in and of itself, as he was saying, could be something that's attributable to anxiety, OCD, depression, ongoing life events, something physiological, something ADHD. But because there's a subset of individuals who have this kind of presentation that looks like co-occurring inattentive ADHD and OCD childhood, where over time that inattentive component tends to remit, either just with age, when there's more frontal lobe development, or with OCD symptoms being treated. That's a really important thing to consider, is whether or not the inattention is sort of its own thing, this sort of ongoing, neurobiological kind of operating system type concern versus, and that's of course oversimplifying it, versus other symptoms that are resulting in some of the same sort of executive functioning and inattention concerns. So as clinicians, we have to be really careful and I think deliberate about, I'm always looking at when somebody comes in, kiddos come in, especially with anxiety, and they also have inattention. I'm really looking at trying to dig into that anxiety, trying to reduce that, and then trying to see if there's anything left over. Now, even if there's leftover, I'm not necessarily going to say that's ADHD. I'm going to keep kind of digging in. So I'm sure you have more to say about that, Dr. Abramowitz.
I mean, I'll go back in time when I started my my PhD research. It all started because I started reading a lot of literature, for example, that imaging studies consistently show underactivity at rest in the prefrontal regions in ADHD, but hyperactivity in OCD at rest. Our studies, we know that ADHD is associated with behavioral impulsivity and risk-taking, and OCD is associated with harm and risk avoidance and inhibited behavior. Much more. So one is sort of a lack of forethought, and the others thinking too much before they do anything, right? So there were so many differences that this got me to basically do my PhD research on that. It was a comparative study, neuropsychological clinical. And so we found there that, first of all, obsessive thoughts cause reduction in cognitive power, right? You have a RAM memory, and you can open so many programs at the same time. But then I was curious because I saw that my mentor and friend, Dr. Daniel Geller from Harvard, at some point reported 36% comorbidity. And I was thinking, wait a second, if the same person could be impulsive, but also cautious, risk, but also risk avoidant.
Yeah, it seems confusing.
Activity and lower activity. It's kind of was problematic for me. So this is what got me to do those research.
So just to talk about the neuropsychology a bit, OCD and ADHD, they implicate the same neural circuit, but they activate it just completely opposite, or they're associated with completely opposite activity.
I think that Scott Rauch, that was a pioneer in neurobiology of OCD, once said that this hyperactivity connecting the frontal areas and the more basal, more automatic areas, that this hyperactivity represents an attempt to control automaticity, to control the impulse, to make sure that everything is under control and deliberate. So one of my examples in one of my publications is about a person with OCD that will be driving for 10 years now, but still deliberate on, I need to signal now, do I need to do this? Basically explicit thinking, which doesn't occur when you have experience in something. It becomes automatic. And we have studies that actually support that by Sorfellow and others that show that, yeah, there is a sort of desire to control. But yeah, the whole idea about sort of two brains, this got me to look very carefully, and I found a lot of indicators that causes us this type of confusion. And I published also clinician guidelines, because, for example, it will be hard for somebody with moderate to severe ADHD to engage every day in elaborate, complex, repetitive actions that demand
that you might see in someone with OCD.
What?
That you might see in someone with OCD, like elaborate, rule-based.
To be deliberate, planned. Some rituals have the rules of do X while not doing Y, for example, which is causing us overload in the executive functioning. And to do that accurately, deliberately every day is something that people with ADHD will be sort of reluctant to do. These elaborate, highly controlled rituals. So this is why what we saw also is that, first of all, the vast majority of comorbidities with OCD is the inattentive type. So maybe we're looking at inattention, but also that the vast majority, I think 70% of the comorbidities are people with primary OCD diagnosed with ADHD, as opposed to people with ADHD diagnosed with comorbid OCD, which is the minority, sometimes single digits. So this still is maybe a confusion here in many cases.
When I think to make it even more confusing there's some of the
Great.
same, let's just go there. I mean, some of the same sort of brain systems are also implicated in tic disorders, and we have a well-developed correlation between both in terms of people with OCD being at increased risk for tics, as well as that sort of conferred genetic risk, like in families, right? If there's a family member with tic disorders, there's a sort of OCD risk conferred in the family and vice versa. And so we often see OCD, ADHD, and tics together. So I think that there is a lot there as well. And tics, if unless I'm mistaken, tics are going to be a little bit more in terms of disinhibition and so forth. Some of that is going to be a little bit closer to ADHD. I would say clinically there are certainly, despite my being cautious in particular with inattentive symptoms and sort of labeling those, we certainly see people with OCD who have all different kinds of presentations, and they may be quite risk averse within their symptom area, and then frankly quite disinhibited in other areas. And so these are people who truly have combined type ADHD. I think there are also, there are people with inattentive ADHD, and some of the studies haven't shown that it's predominantly just inattentive ADHD. So it's a confusing sort of morass. And I personally wonder if that's partially because there are these different subtypes of OCD that might be more or less co-occurring or comorbid with ADHD, in particular, like just right symptoms. So that was a lot. But
There's a lot to ask questions about. I think I'm going to ask a basic question first, and then try to ask more complicated questions. What is the rate of prevalence? Like, what is the rate of ADHD diagnoses in people with primary OCD, and then the opposite, primary ADHD? What rate are they diagnosed with OCD?
I actually did systematic review of this, so
cool. Good person to ask.
Among children, there is fivefold more comorbidity within primary ADHD. It was I think my systematic review, it's 25%, and in children that have OCD, comorbidity is diagnosed 4%.
Wait, so in children, there's a higher. If you have ADHD, you're more likely to be diagnosed with OCD, rather than if you have OCD, you're more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD.
Yeah, in children, 25% of children with primary OCD also are diagnosed with ADHD. A quarter, 1 in 4.
Okay.
But if you have OCD, it's only 4% that will that be diagnosed with the comorbid ADHD.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I'm curious.
Yes, you please.
How much of that? Let's take people with OCD, and they have a higher rate of ADHD or ADD. How much is that ADHD going to be due to the anxiety and anxiety associated with OCD, as opposed to a completely separate condition? Do we know? I mean, as a clinician, you would want to separate that out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or I don't. Maybe you would.
How can you?
I mean, Storch. I mean, Andrew Guzik from the Storch group did a study where they took a sample of kids with OCD. They treated only CBT for OCD, but they also assessed for ADHD symptoms before and after treatment.
Yeah.
And there was a very significant reduction in ADHD symptoms, even though it was not diagnosed or treated. And this is what I do many times in my clinic. In my practice, when I see somebody that I cannot say if they have ADHD, sometimes it's very clear from childhood, but if I cannot say, sometimes we wait until we see if things are improving. And I also wanted to mention that it's more than just an academic discussion. My concern was always about the mistreatment, not the diagnosis. First of all, CBT for ADHD and OCD are completely different things. But more importantly, A teacher sees this kid in class, not really paying attention. They call upon this kid. They don't really know where they are in the class. They don't want to answer, sort of feel anxious. And maybe tell the parents that maybe want to take an assessment because there's probably ADHD, because the kid is inattentive. But maybe that kid is sitting there and counting pages or freaking out because potential contamination on the desk. Now, misdiagnosis is one thing, but I find it not only my research, and there's a lot of actually case studies. In my own experience, I see sometimes people with OCD that is not diagnosed that come to me because they have ADHD, and they're procrastination and a lot of those inattention and avoidance, right? But then we realize that they are on Adderall, for example.
Yeah.
Now, Adderall on the somatic level increases 15% blood pressure. Heart rate is a bit stronger also. It mimics what anxiety is. So what we see is that people are more, basically this kind of medication will get more anxious, potential for exacerbation of OCD symptoms from these stimulants. Some people will say, I think one of my clients used to say that when I take the pill, I have better attention. I can hear my obsessions, the OCD voice more clearly and more loudly, right? Crisp. And then when you see them go off the medication, immediately they feel a general reduction in anxiety and stress. So sometimes the treatment, especially for young children, when we see sometimes new onset of full-blown OCD, there are case studies to show that because of the stimulants. This is what worries me most about misdiagnosis, less so in the context of CBT, but with medication, because I see people taking those medications for a decade and don't know that this is the cause of their suffering. Yeah, they will be less distracted because it's a stimulant, but they will pay a price.
And meanwhile, if they just did CBT for their OCD, that would take care of the attentional difficulties as well.
Yeah.
But I mean,
seemingly attentional difficulties.
How do you parse out, and maybe this is a good question for Amy, like how do you parse out if you're assessing a client, is this OCD and they're just inattentive because of the OCD, or is this like actually co-occurring ADHD and OCD?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that I think treating the OCD first. So if you know there is OCD for sure, and you're suspecting that there may or may not be ADHD, and particularly if you're thinking there might be ADHD, more the inattentive type. Now, even the hyperactive type, because sometimes, in kiddos, it can look like a child is doing a ritual and it's like a wiggly ritual, because some kids will have that, or a just right thing. That can look like ADHD as well, hyperactive type. So if you're doing a pretty good assessment, you recognize, okay, there's some OCD there. First line treatment there is CBT for OCD, reduce that, and then sort of see, what's left over, I suppose. And that would be my approach as a clinician, as opposed to coming in and saying, okay, we're going in hot with both of these diagnoses. Or even, some people will say, well, you need to go and get tested for ADHD. I'm like, well, the tests are still, if somebody's distracted by either internal stimuli, i.e. something like, intrusive thoughts, or external stimuli, ooh, I saw that they touched that, and then did I touch that, or something like that. Even the tests themselves could be subject to, because our tests a lot of them are very, they're either sort of cognitive tasks, which are putting a load on your distraction or attention. So if you already have some of like Dr. Abramowitz said, if you have some of that, your RAM that's doing OCD, right? Even if you're going to test it, it's still going to look like ADHD. We also have a lot of parent report measures for ADHD. And those, again, are very what we would call face valid. So they're going to say things like, loses items, gets distracted, etc. And so again, regardless, so that's what I would say is treat the OCD first. And I certainly see folks with both. I mean, I know that there are, before some of the more systematic reviews, prevalence rates of ADHD within OCD were ranging from 0 to 60% based on the study, right? So I would say, it's somewhere in between there, but we really want to be deliberate about treating the OCD first.
And let me add, now it's my turn to add some more complication. So
Great.
in our here is something early on that we started figuring out, looking at the brain. Inhibition resides, largely in the frontal area, right?
Mhm.
So if a person, this is our initial thoughts, were if a person has a problem inhibiting their behavior, right, managing that, it probably has another aspect where they have a problem inhibiting their thoughts, because it's the same inhibition, just different. Basically, one of them is behavior, one of them is basically thought content. And we did a study to see to compare basically OCD and ADHD in terms of the intrusive thoughts. And to complicate things, we found, and this has been replicated, people with ADHD experiencing significantly more intrusive thoughts, right? So in terms of looking at more carefully diagnoses, we find that, first of all, you need to be very clear about the content, because OCD has a quality, a dimension to it, and in ADHD we found that it's more general. So it's sort of we found that it's sort of in OCD, one sort of actively almost generates those thoughts, gives room to those thoughts because engaging in compulsion. While in ADHD it's more random, seems more like a normal flow of thoughts with problem regulating it, as opposed to with OCD, where it's an inherent part of the mechanism. They appear, you do something, they appear again. So even that is confusing. And I find that if we're talking about adults, which is mostly my clientele, I'm going back to childhood. Sometimes we find the person that I have ADHD and it's so bad. And how was your childhood? I was an A student. I read a ton of books. I did my homework every time, never missed a day in class. Any behavioral problems? No. But right now that I'm in college, it's overwhelming. I can't focus on anything, right? And so these cases will be a bit clearer. But if you work with kids for assessment, as John we talked about many times, it's very hard to get an accurate depiction of the content of those thoughts and what did they lead you to do, right? So it's even more challenging there.
Yeah, I was going to ask about like situations where, well, the thing about inhibition and like an ADHD having kind of trouble inhibiting intrusive thoughts, that's very complex. So I want to know first, what sort of questions might a clinician ask to like get a sense of whether these are intrusive thoughts that are ADHD more related or OCD related? And then John, your name was brought up. Like, how do you do this stuff in kids with, whose insight might be low or who can't explain where their thoughts are coming from?
Oh, were you asking John or were you asking us?
Anyone who thinks they have answers.
Yeah.
I'm searching.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, goodness, with kiddos, I feel like, I always look at, when we go back to assessment, I am a big proponent of whenever I'm giving a Y box or a Psi box, whenever I'm giving any kind of initial assessment, I know there are self-report versions. I know that they're validated. I know that they're just as accurate in some ways, in many ways, as doing it as a clinical interview. But I feel like, especially with kids, if you're going through and you're starting out with a checklist of, hey, here's some common worries that kids sometimes, brains can pop up all kinds of things, and you're really attending to these particular content areas, because OCD does tend to kind of fall into, these categories. We say the themes don't matter. Okay, they do and they don't, but they tend to be, in these specific areas. So question number one is, is the nature of the thoughts, is it more, ADHD versus OCD? So I'm looking for ego dystonic. I'm looking for the themes that we usually see. And again, ego dystonic, hey, these are thoughts that are really bugging me, versus ADHD sort of, quote unquote, intrusive thoughts. It's sort of like the barrage of all the thoughts that are happening. Oh, I'm going to go to the baseball game later. I have to study for my math test. It's just that they're not sort of filtered or regulated. So they're all coming in, but the content is going to be different. Now, your second question about how to get kids to talk about that, I think goes back to, as an assessor, really normalizing and just talking about, you ever have any thoughts about like bodies? What do you mean? Well, naked bodies, or, like you want to do something that you're not supposed to do, or private parts. It's just like going there. And a lot of times, they will have disclosed things to their parents already. And I think it's just being patient, building rapport. So, yeah, I don't know if anybody has.
And I completely agree. Just to add to that, we've been talking about the difficulties in trying to parse apart what's OCD, what's ADD, what's ADHD. When we're making diagnoses in the mental health realm, we're talking about probabilities. There's not a test that we can do, like a COVID test. Is it COVID or is it some other sort of virus? So we're talking about probabilities, and that's where I think having knowledge, like what Amitai and Amy are giving to us, and understanding, these different things that could be generating hypotheses based on data that's collected through a thorough assessment, and then, using treatment and observing treatment response to test those hypotheses. And sometimes it's going to be trial and error. I agree with something that Amitai said a little bit earlier, which is that the diagnosis is not as important as, what are you doing as far as treatment. I hate to think that these kids who have OCD and look ADHD are giving stimulants, which we know can be unhealthy for people, and they're missing out on the right treatment, which is help their OCD and their attentional symptoms go down. So if we're careful, we do a thorough assessment, we consider all these different possibilities, I think that's the best we can do.
Yeah. Oh, go
ahead.
No, I just want to say that if we're talking about those questions in adults, like John said, first of all, I looked at the mechanism. I look at what is the consequences of those thoughts. What do you do or don't do? I'm trying to identify the mechanism where those thoughts lead you to avoid something or doing something. And second of all, when I do the assessment and ask questions from the DSM, ADHD, can't be distracted, can complete tasks that requires a lot of mental effort and all of this, forgetful. And we found that in our studies as well. People with OCD have different standards. For example, we found that it's very clear people with OCD are far less behaviorally impulsive. But on the question, are you an impulsive person? There is no difference than combined ADHD. Because for someone with OCD, to make one mistake or to drop a glass or something by mistake means that I have no control. And this goes to those symptoms. Do you have a hard time focusing? Yeah, I'm overwhelmed. What I do is I'm almost like functional analysis. Okay, so let's dive into this one. Tell me, what happens to you when you talk about distractibility, when you sit there in front of the computer, right? So sometimes people are distracted by sense of disgust because of dust on the screen, right? Distracted because of other things that are related to their OCD. So I want to look very carefully at what do you mean by forgetfulness. In many cases, I find that in ADHD, people they don't have a lot of, you need to be attend to something to remember where you put it, right? But in OCD, sometimes I find that, last year I had it 2 times where I didn't find something. So I'm forgetful. Twice out of 10,000, right? It's quite a different scale. And lastly, I just want to say that I see the interaction very, very, very frequently with clinical perfectionism because of procrastination, because of avoidance, and because that it leads to depression, which also robs you from other resources. And we see that in many cases, people to become better at executive functioning, even though that's not the problem. So my advice is that, and in children, it's much more complicated, but with adults, my advice is not only to go over history, which is developmental history is very important, but also to dive into, okay, if you have OCD, I want to make sure that the chain of those events, the OCD ones, this dynamic does not cause you to those seemingly what I call in my research ADHD-like symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
I will say too, occasionally you'll have those people. So classic kind of OCD presentation, the research is not consistently showing at all sort of like memory deficits or memory differences for people with OCD, but there is this reduced confidence in one's memory. So, I think I misplaced it, or I think I have to look again. But I do have a subset of clients who have both, and I want to just affirm that for people out there who truly have both, who will say things like, classic OCD presentation when I'm asking about symptoms such as like, well, do you have to check over and over again, say before you leave a restaurant to make sure you have things? And they'll say yes. And I'll say, well, when's the last time you didn't check and you left them there? Most of them will be like, well, that's never happened, And then there's a subset of people for whom, they'll say, well, I do sometimes. This is actually sort of a coping strategy that I have. And I have to determine, okay, is that more ADHD with these OCD, like, just to flip it on its head. We've been talking about OCD looking like ADHD. Sometimes ADHD can look like OCD, and sometimes it's a little bit of both. So I think, really, talking about that, doing the functional analysis, because most folks with another good example will be, impulsivity. Oh, I'm worried. I have this OC symptom. I'm worried that I'm going to blurt out something embarrassing or inappropriate while I'm on the research roundtable with these people I respect so much, And then if you all say like, well, have you ever done that? No, but I'm just really worried about it, versus like, well, I do get in trouble sometimes because I talk before I'm thinking, right? So those are the kinds of differentials and things. And, the truth is some folks have both, and particularly childhood onset OCD with co-occurring tics, there is a higher probability of there being true ADHD as well, because you sort of have this, it's like the what do they call it, the triad or trifecta?
I didn't think hard about what that sentence meant, but I figured it out.
And so I think about that as being like multiple levels of sort of disinhibition, motor disinhibition, disinhibition cognitively, et cetera. And so there can be a lot more complexity when you have all of that going on.
Yeah, and I have to say that one issue is sort of, first of all, I've seen clients with Tourette's, ADHD, and OCD. I'm not sure that Tourette's does not elicit symptoms of OCD and ADHD, but I actually work with people that have full-blown, the three of them. These are harder cases to treat. First of all, medication, stimulants can exacerbate tics and vice versa. And, the struggle is real. Think about work. If you have OCD and tics, and it's very problematic. But one thing that we need to know, sort of to understand about real life, is most psychologists, they know what, they're well trained, they will do a careful diagnosis. But many people will go, especially young adults, go to the doctor, a physician. I'm in college, I'm inattentive, I can't focus. Oh, okay, here's some medication here. And maybe post hoc, they will put ADHD in the computer, I don't know. But basically you're diagnosed, doctors usually treat symptoms, not syndromes. Mm-hmm. We know differently. So it's not sufficient, and they're not trained to look at comorbidities, right? Physicians, they have a lot on their minds, they know a lot of things, but not psychopathology so much. So, but sometimes we see those people 10 years after that, taking stimulants and suffering. And I think one of those hidden factors that we know that OCD usually, about 10 years, maybe more after initial symptoms, you get treated. Some of those are masked by these medications that you get since you're a teenager. And if a parent goes with a 14-year-old, the physician says, this is the pill for inattention, I'll take it, right? This is probably ADHD. So this is why there's a problem here with which person basically is determining what do you have and how.
Well, and agreed 100%, but also just a lack of understanding of OCD and anxiety among folks, like primary care physicians, pediatricians, who are often the first line, right? They should know.
Yeah, well, I'm curious. I'm in the process of applying to medical school. I'm curious to see how they'll treat these sorts of comorbidity discussions, especially in psychopathology, but it sounds like maybe it won't be treated at all. Pending, to be determined. You were talking earlier, Dr. Abramowitz, about like doing a functional analysis, and I was curious if you're treating someone with, or you're talking to someone just with ADHD rather, what will they say when you press further as to like, why were you distracted looking at your computer screen? Like, what would a typical response look like?
So first of all, we need to separate between what's going on these days with procrastination, which I always tell people and my students and my clients, listen, you're sitting in front of the computer and you have a daunting, you need to read and analyze and write a report about, a 30-page paper with font 5. And you're about to do that, right? So this is what you have. On the other hand, a click away, you have an ice cream sundae. Everything, dopamine
That's
rush,
awesome. Yeah.
social media, whatever. It's just a click away. So these days, it's inherently more difficult. But when I ask people with ADHD, it's like the issue is not they don't go back to talk about it's because of that. It's just a feature of who I am. It's not that sometimes I'm more like that, and sometimes I was always. It was impossible for me to stand in line to get movie tickets, or I was never able to focus more than 20 minutes or 20 seconds or 2 minutes on reading a book, even though I wanted to read. And it's not about anxiety, and it's not about indecisiveness, and it's not about feeling that I know, right? It's just because, it's like the sustained attention. We know that people with, and I met people with ADHD that don't have more than 2 minutes, literally. We needed to practice that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not about avoidance, it's about objective difficulty. And also you will see that across the board, not when you have a lot of OCD symptoms, or not when you're stressed, or not only in school, or only in the presence of others with social anxiety. It's always there, period. It's on a menu, reading this, focusing on, you're trying to write a quick text, but somebody is talking to you, and immediately causes an overload, regardless of what goes on in your mind. So I would try to dive there. And by the way, ADHD is considered to be congenital. You don't get ADHD when you're 30. You grew up with this. This is a sort of the genetic factor in ADHD is second to bipolar. It's I think about 74%. OCD is 28.
What does genetic factor mean exactly?
How much of this phenomenon you can explain percentage-wise by genetic variability?
Okay. So. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, are we seeing over time? This is going to be two different questions. It seem like they're the same, but they're different. Are we seeing? Do you guys think over time a rise in the diagnosis of ADHD? And the second question is, you think over time the actual incidence of actual ADHD is rising? And I say that because I think that it is overdiagnosed, right? So number of diagnoses is probably different than the number of actual cases.
Mm-hmm. My honest answer to the second question is I don't know. But my honest answer to the first question is I think, yes, there's more ADHD diagnosed, and there's a sort of I feel like there's a lower threshold to diagnose ADHD that I'm seeing sort of in the community, so that when kids are going to pediatricians, there's less of a protocol. There's less of a let's get, a few questionnaires from your teachers and then here we go. So I am seeing that a little bit more. I'm also seeing more of self-diagnosis with ADHD. And so this sort of under the umbrella of neurodiversity, that more people are kind of saying, hey, I identify with this. And so, and I wonder if that gets, that's different than clinical diagnosis. And I don't know if those are folks who are, getting medication or anything like that, or if they're, I would hope not, without sort of a, clinical evaluation. So I'm definitely seeing that more. I'm also seeing it more as sort of just a cultural thing. And we've been through this with OCD, where people are like, look at my OCD. I lined up my pencils. There's a sort of analog to that in the ADHD world, where there are people talking about oh, that's just my ADHD. I'm sort of forgetting. I think the second question is complicated by some of the things we were talking about with this sort of multiple attention demands, meaning it's complicated in terms of picking out what's truly ADHD versus what's sort of we're living in overstimulated environments. That being said, if we're thinking about it truly as sort of a neurobiological phenomenon, that's something that's there from birth, then I think it is about looking again across contexts. So I don't know that I really don't know, because I don't know the research if it's going up, but yeah, that's what I'm observing clinically.
So, John, one thing we need to remember is definitions are changing. The DSM-5 decided that instead of 6 minimum out of the 9, which was always there, in adults you need 5 suddenly. So if before the DSM-5 you had 5, it's like, you're healthy, you're good, everything is okay. Oh, sorry, they changed that. Now you have a problem because they changed the book.
Right.
Another thing is that American Academy of Pediatrics, if I'm not wrong, it was 2015, maybe before that, they lowered the formal age of diagnosis for ADHD to 4, which to me is problematic because it's like, what problems do you have in attention? You read books a lot, you need to listen in class, you're 4.
Yeah.
But they reduced the age, so now that you have a larger chunk, it used to be 9, then 6, now 4, you have a larger chunk of population you can diagnose. So the prevalence, if you don't control for segments of age, can increase. But I totally agree with you, Amy. There is this notion that you're either happy, joy, fully functional, never procrastinate, or you have psychopathology. But studies show us, for example, that almost a quarter of people that do not have anything meaningful present with symptoms of a mild traumatic brain injury. Studies show that, none of us are, we struggle. We struggle with information. We struggle. Every time I teach about ADHD, raise your hand if you have that. Everybody's distracted these days. 100% will say, yeah, I tend to be distracted. Of course you're distracted. You get, on your phone from all those, text and all the, whatever, social media. It's a lot. And people think they need to process that all the time and respond and be on top of stuff. Another issue, you're going to med school. I have a friend that is now a physician, but when I went to med school a few years ago, and they were told this by the dean: listen, you're still studying the same 4 years here, but since I was a student, the amount of information in medicine is about 50 times more, but you still have the same number of hours a day and the same years that you cannot, and he told them, you never capture all of it, right? If you get to 70% of knowledge, which we were required to know everything, 70% of knowledge now is good. So like you said, Amy, that we are bombarded, we have more information, more ways to get that. So we become, more distracted. And of course, all the competitiveness today with the grades and everything causes more stress. So students are struggling. And it makes it harder to find where is, especially given that stimulants usually help people. This is why we drink coffee, right? So it makes it hard to know who is the person that has real ADHD here.
Can we go back to you made a point about the DSM. So it's there are how many?
I always like to rag on the DSM.
I do like to, and I'm going to rag all the time on it. So the DSM criteria for ADHD, right? You got to have, it's 6 now, 6 or more?
6 out of the first 9, and then 6 out of the second 9. But in adults, you only need 5.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen if I'm allowed to do that.
This is a new feature on the Research Roundtable. No one's ever shared their screen before.
Yeah, welcome to the. All right, so here we go. So share my screen. Share.
Let's see if you can pull this off.
I don't know. Brennan might have to.
Okay. He did it.
So,
good job, John.
So these are the 9, criteria, right, for inattentiveness. So let's just read these. So often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork, right, or other activities. Often has trouble holding attention on tasks. If you have 1, you have 2. Right. If you have number 1, you also have number 2. So, so often doesn't seem to listen when spoken to directly. And then that's number 3. Number 4 is often does not follow through on instructions or fails to finish, schoolwork, chores, duties. Like, again, if you have number 3, you also have number 4. Has trouble, or basically what I'm saying is you got these 9 criteria, but really they're kind of, they boil down to 1 or 2 things. And same thing
because these are symptoms of inattention, basically. This represents what happened when you're not attentive. Right?
Yeah. Look at hyperactivity. So you got to have 6 or more, right? Often fidgets or taps hands, feet, or squirms in seat.
Yeah, because no person with OCD ever fidgeted, right?
Right. Yeah. Often leaves seat in situations where remaining in seat is expected. Like if you have the first one, you're also going to have the second one. What's the use of having so many different? Often runs about or climbs in situations where it's not appropriate. Well, that's the same thing as 1 and 2. right? I mean, I don't. Again, I'm kind of ragging
And
on.
for adults and adolescents, John is also restless, which is also very rare. It's very specific. Being restless is just about ADHD, right? It's so general, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's the word often, which like,
Right.
how do you interpret that? What does that mean?
Exactly. It's subjective.
I
And
look
I
at my phone every 30 minutes, or no, 30 seconds probably.
Yeah. I think
But it
too.
just shows again like the subjectivity of like these kinds of diagnoses. Anyway, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, like, and I think also for those of us who work with kiddos, it takes a lot of knowledge about normative development, right? It takes a lot, because when I'm looking at a child who is 6 versus a child who's 10, I'm going to expect more of the squirminess. I'm going to expect there's interruption, there's difficulty. Like there is a normative level of inattention as, you know, you have frontal lobe development and maturation and that kind of thing to, and more demands put on you and so forth. So to provide a counterpoint, I am a fan of being able to diagnose ADHD at lower ages, because I do think that there are some kids who are hitting you over the head with it. They are hitting you over the head. It's more rare. And what I mean by that is you just have to be really developmentally sensitive and know what a 4-year-old looks like. So you're knowing where to look for the deviations and so forth. So, I mean, I see the pros and the cons, but I think the cons are that you're not necessarily going to have clinicians who are that, you know, if you're just going down a checklist and it's like, yeah, all kids have this, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose like I have so many thoughts. We can like rag on the DSM all the time, but at some point, like the diagnosis that a kid ends up getting matters in the sense that like, you know, that kid might go to a psychiatrist and then all of a sudden he's on a stimulant because like you have to give an F code for insurance purposes and, you know, so on and so forth. So like it is kind of arbitrary, but it also does seem to matter that we talk about like exactly how to parse out these things in like just a practical sense.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And not just for medication, because when you think about things like accommodations, this is so interesting, right? Because in the world of OCD, when we hear accommodations, we're sort of trained to think like, oh no, accommodations are things that you do that are kind of making concessions for the anxiety and that like allow the anxiety to flourish while one's world gets smaller and smaller. Accommodations in ADHD, true ADHD in the educational setting, can be quite helpful in terms of allowing for a child to truly work to their potential. So even behaviorally, if you have something that is anxiety or OCD related, and then you're doing accommodations, oh, well, you don't have to, you know, pass the papers to them because they get really distracted. Well, no, if it's contamination, we don't want to foster that avoidance. But if it is an ADHD thing where, you know, well, let's get preferential seating, let's get extra time, et cetera. So extra time for a kid with OCD related perfectionism is actually going to do them a disservice, because it's doing what? It's giving them more time to do their compulsions. Extra time for a kid with true ADHD is going to allow for them to work to their potential. So that's just sort of like behaviorally, not only medication wise. We want to make those distinctions.
Yeah, and a great point. And the accommodation in ADHD doesn't maintain the symptoms. It doesn't make them worse like it would in OCD. It's a really important distinction.
Yep.
So, by the way, it's not, we're not dealing here with, it's not about ADHD, but when there is ADHD, first of all, it's unprecedented the effectiveness of medication. It's about 75% of people will see a dramatic change in their lives. And it's not only in attention, it's about emotional regulation, impulsivity, obviously better performance outcomes. So I've seen many people that, I mean, I had a client once ask me, tell me, now that I start medication, I have to ask you something. Does stimulant medication, like Ritalin or something like that, the methylphenidate improves your hearing? Because I'm hearing more things when I listen to my favorite band, and I'm like, it's just listening to music without noise, right? It's more focused. But also kids listen to when the diagnosis is right, is valid. We'll get feedback from kids themselves. I can sit down and listen, or the teachers will tell you, oh my God, and this is, to me, it's like a screen. that limits, because there are gifted people with ADHD, obviously, it just limits your ability to express your full intellectual potential, more so than many other disorders, because there is no inherent issue here, right? It's not even like dyslexia, where there is a functional issue with the ability to learn something or to engage with something. This is just a general sort of like a veil. It's something that obfuscates your ability to express your full intellectual potential. Yeah.
And it's probably you said this. It probably exists on a continuum. And when it becomes a problem is when we make a diagnosis. I think we would all benefit from stimulants. There's probably a magic.
We all like coffee, Dr.
There's probably a magic dose that for even people who don't technically have ADHD, it would still improve. Which is why, isn't it like a big black market drug, like around finals time on campuses and things like that?
What?
Studies show that 34% of medical students without ADHD take stimulants during med school. Yeah. And by the way, yeah, that's what stimulants.
We used to take Jolt, like to pull an all-nighter before final, like that drink.
There was a recent, very large review of genetics of ADHD, and I was very surprised to see that these are sort of ultra biological, genetic people. They said that everything, taking under consideration, everything suggests that we need to start looking at ADHD and a dimension of basically a reduced, inhibition, motion regulation, and it makes much more sense when they look at the dimensional part. They saw that, like many other disorders, that it's far more informative. Mm-hmm. So it is a dimension, yeah.
I want to do some justice to the question that we got in the chat. There was one at 1210. Speaking of genetics, is there a genetic overlap between OCD and ADHD?
Oh, so there are two large studies. One argued that there is nothing there. One argued there's a little bit there. But earlier works were sort of very confident that there is. Now it's probably, if we're talking about the syndrome, full-blown OCD, full-blown ADHD, one of them is about 5-HT, more about sort of serotonin receptors genetics with OCD, and the other one is about DRD4, 5, and 7 in ADHD. So even the genes that are focusing on are different, but there's some suggestion that, again, with that if you add tick to the equation, that will sort of make more sense because apparently they tend to come together when there is tick in the background, but less so full-blown two syndromes together.
Yeah, that triad's been brought up a lot, and that's quite confusing. John, I feel like you've probably heard of it before. I've never heard of that. Is it thought that like a tick disorder is somehow like the bridge between the two, or how to make sense of that triad? How should I try to make sense of it?
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You have a subject for your thesis.
I do think that's where, like there's all this talk about Tourette's OCD, right? Like, if you've heard about that, which is like just right symptoms, or sometimes it's like a tapping and it doesn't really, there's no feared consequence necessarily. I think thinking about it as, there is more of that kind of, with ADHD and OCD, you're seeing more of those like just right type symptoms, as well as some hoarding and collecting type things.
And yeah, we call those compultics, right? That they have the quality of the preliminary urge, so premonitory urge.
Never heard that word before.
The premonitory urge to tick suggests that it's not a reflective motor tick. It's usually an urge that you can't identify because it's too fast that you comply with. This is why the concept of premonitory urge to tick is very effective in treatment. The identification of the urge, as opposed to I did something and now I already did that, and I want to. There is some more of an OCD quality in tics than we thought previously historically.
Yeah, and it's just about sort of teaching people to get that awareness of their premonitory urge, because most people will say, well, this is entirely involuntary.
Yeah.
Well, okay, well, if we increase your awareness, most people will say, well, there's a little bit of a tingle, there's a little bit of a, something there. And so you can think about sort of the OC cycle, and like, it's kind of, a similar.
Like a mini OC cycle, yeah.
Mini OC cycle, yeah.
We are running very low We're
Oh,
out
yeah.
of time.
We're out of time, but I have a lot more questions.
We'll have to have our good friends back at some point soon.
Yeah, I have a page of questions that I always try to ask. And I have bullets 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 still completely untouched.
Let's do the sequel at some point.
There you go.
But yeah, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Dr. Abramowitz and Dr. Mary Askin for coming. Just some closing announcements. This is one live stream of a bunch of different live streams. If you want to see the entire schedule of future live streams, go to iocdf.org/live streams. I just said the word live stream a lot. And you can sign up for IOCDF news and updates at iocdf.org/sign up. This live stream will go on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook. So yeah, please share with anyone who you think this might be helpful for, and thanks for coming.
Thank you for having us for the live stream.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was super fun.
Always a pleasure.
All right.
See everybody
Bye-bye,
next
everybody.
month.